Good.
So, Lisa, do you want to tell us how it's all going to begin?
Yeah, so we're keeping track of who's in the waiting room, and we'll open that up at a certain point. We usually give it a minute or two after to make sure we're all settled, and I'll introduce everybody. And then I don't know what you guys have planned. Like, how do you want to handle it from there?
Okay, that's super. Brett is our esteemed moderator. So after you do the introductions, Brett is going to take it away. And we're going to start basically with Brett sort of asking Barbara a question so that she can give some context to who the Whartons are, why is the Wharton studio important.
I'm sorry, I hate to remember, but we had said that we would that you advised me to do a 11 or 12-minute reading. And that's what I was planning to do as an introduction to the Whartons. Is that still what you would like me to do?
Sure. So what part of the book are you reading?
Well, remember, we had discussed this and you had said rather than doing a section from the book,
yeah,
I would do a reading that was a general introduction, basically taken from that a New York State Archives magazine article that's coming out next week, actually now.
To people who have done sort of these kinds of Zoom events before, does that seem like a long segment or?
Maybe a little. I think it would be great to hear a little from the book, maybe 5 minutes, but I'm open to
well, I don't have anything prepared from the book now because we decided it would be difficult to take a discrete unit out that would make sense to a lot of people. Since so much of the book is highly specialized, I didn't want to talk for 5 minutes about exploits of Elaine, for example.
Right.
So this is a general introduction to the Whartons.
I think that's fine. I think
okay.
That's
I think that's,
go ahead.
I think that's fine too. And then we can get into a conversation about what this means in the present day. It's history, you know, which for me is very interesting as a filmmaker and as a teacher of filmmaking here. So I'd love to get into and those are connected to your book, like the chapter on independent, you know, dealing with the actual financial reality of being there and producing work. Anyway, that's what I'd love to talk about.
Okay.
Great.
And Barbara, are you going to hold up the book at some point?
I hadn't planned to, but
we can all do it.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So then Brett will sort of. Brett, maybe you could welcome everybody. Thank Buffalo Street Books for being a wonderful host and everything, and then just introduce Barbara without having to reintroduce her title and everything, and explain that we're going to hear a little excerpt from.
Sure. Yeah. Is there any sort of, you know, since if I'm moderating, is there a, you know, general sort of set of topics that we want to sort of make sure that we cover, or is this going to be just more sort of freewheeling? I guess that would be my question as far as how you want it to go from, you know, I mean, we've got a time limit. Do we want to have an open period for questions from other attendees and you know, so I'm just trying to sort of be a clock watcher here and try to sort of understand where we want to make things fit along the way. I mean, figure 15 minutes for questions probably, or should it be longer? 15 sounds good. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say 10.
Some nodding of heads.
Sometimes there's a lot of questions and sometimes there's very few questions. So
yeah. So Lisa, you've done some of these already for the bookstore, right? Yeah. I guess maybe how have they run? What's the typical?
So I think a short reading and then in conversation where different, you know, the different people are bringing up different questions, and then time for questions at the end.
Okay.
But a lot of times, if it's been going really well, there's not that much time for questions at the end, and if that happens, that's okay too.
Okay.
You know, sometimes there's a lot of questions, oftentimes there's not. So.
And at some point, I just want my role, better than expounding on the film history, which I will leave to Barbara, Brett, and Cathy, is just a moment to kind of talk about Wharton Studio Museum, and why there is a Wharton Studio Museum and what it's doing and how it's, you know, it's preserving and celebrating this history and why it's important to do that. And mention the original studio building and all that, because
I mean,
I think
we
most
could
people
take
are
it, we've
local.
got a little time here. We could take it where I introduce one person and then, like, I could introduce Diana and you would talk about Wharton Studio Museum and the evolution of the book, and then introduce Brett and Cathy.
Yeah, I think
and
that should come
something like
after.
that could work.
I think the sort of Wharton Studio Museum piece, which is a little bit more promotional in nature to let people know about the organization and what it's doing, should follow at some
Okay.
point organically.
Okay, so that'll happen somewhere along the way. So I will introduce everybody except our author, and Brett will introduce the author. Is that how we're going then?
Do we have a bio for Barbara then that I should read?
I can
Because I don't have that.
everyone too. I just heard
Why
Diana
don't you just
say,
if you introduce everyone? I think that's
okay,
fine.
I'll introduce
Yeah.
everyone, and then you'll step up and read, and
Okay.
then you guys will figure it out from there.
Exactly. We'll wing
Sounds
it.
great.
It works.
Sounds great. I'm gonna refill my water glass then.
Yes,
Too.
very important. And I apologize, you may hear my cat howling. She just howls. I will mute when I'm done talking so that, you know.
So are the people on the Zoom muted during everything?
Usually they come in muted, and I will mention, you know, stay muted and just listen until you have a question at the end, or.
Okay.
We've
like
been selling the book quite well. I mean, we've had steady orders. I should have looked before I left today, but it's our
Do you
second
know
day
how
of
many?
being open. I don't know. It's our second day of being open to the public today.
Oh,
and
cool.
I'm honestly fairly fried, so I didn't think to right.
I can understand. Do you need me to drop off more of the postcards? Are those still going?
No, we still have those cards. They're right on our front table going in. So,
super.
yeah. It's weird after all this time of not having customers. I think we've all gotten like used to a different way of being, and even though it's been perfectly fine, it's exhausting.
Yep.
Even just driving today out to the lake, there were so many more people walking around downtown Ithaca than I had become accustomed to, and it was very jarring.
It's like, who are you people?
They were being distant and wearing masks, so it was good. But still, it was just like
lovely people. But still,
there was a crowd. Crowds are still already.
Respect.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just there's a level now of like a loosening of concern a bit. It has to do, I think, with the weather and the good numbers in the county, and
Yeah, and then there's all the overriding news with Cornell and IC and everything, and everyone coming back, and it's like, what's gonna happen then?
Insanity.
Most likely, yes.
That's my prediction.
Well,
but maybe not. Maybe it'll be chaotic, I think.
Let me just take a moment and say thank you very much to all of you for your gracious and generous support of the book. I very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really beautiful.
Book, Barbara. Thank you for doing the book.
It's a pretty shiny book.
It is, isn't it?
It's very shiny.
Lisa, you might want to mention, maybe you already were going to, just you know, that this was an event that was rescheduled twice, and thank folks for finding us. Yeah, so we
Brett, you want to do that when you're?
I will do that.
Oh, please.
Try. If I miss something, y'all just have to fill in.
Sure.
We have 4 people in the waiting room, and it's 7 o'clock. Also, we tend to lock the room at about 10 after, just so y'all know. So people can't come in after that point, but just to keep the Zoom bombing at a minute. So Lisa, I'm going to make you co-host so you also can add people in. I may have my camera off and step away. I've got to deal with dinner and children. I'll be listening. But whenever you want me to let these folks in, just let me know.
Thanks, Eleanor.
Oh, thank you.
I haven't perfected my lighting.
Oh, it's impossible anyway. Just
Yeah.
I'm in a I'm facing a window. I'm trying to.
Well, facing a window is better than having one at your back,
Wait.
which I'm kind of hard to avoid in most rooms in my house. So.
So this is happening right next to me right now.
Oh.
Oh yeah, there's a good chance. I'll try to keep my finger on the mute
Yeah, you
button,
have howling dogs.
I have howling dogs. So yeah. The beagle pug mix particularly is reactive to motion outside.
Cute, from what I can tell.
They're very adorable, yes, but noisy.
Brett, it's going to be like so long before we open Cinemapolis. Is that true?
Well, we don't know yet because the state has not given us guidelines. We are just about to pull the trigger, and there'll be a more public announcement about it to renovate our bathrooms to sort of basically make them touchless environments. So that will determine, certainly that will determine our ability to reopen, because we're not going to, I wouldn't feel comfortable opening the place back up until public bathrooms were as, touch free as possible. And I mean, what's odd is I have not seen much in the way of guidelines from the state on bathrooms. And we're getting into phase 4 now, where restaurants are able to be open with, a certain capacity, and there's really not much mention of what restroom facilities need to look like, or what measures need to be taken to provide them. And I think that's really a missed. It's a big gaping hole in the way that the plans have been laid out, because obviously if we're encouraging people to come back to city centers and drink and eat and be entertained, people have to do the other thing after things go in. They have to come back out. So not planning for that, particularly given that this is a virus that is communicable by human fluids, I think is there's a missed opportunity there. So we're going to try to keep them as...
You're going to lead the vanguard in that.
Well, I guess so. Yeah.
I guess you have to.
Folks,
Whether you like
screenings and drive-ins.
folks, sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt. I want to go ahead and let folks in. You
Let
ready?
people in?
Yeah, we should
Yeah.
let people in.
I'm admitting in 6 folks.
Awesome.
Like,
Okay.
Oh, Alan Rose, I know him.
Bill's my board chair. Susan Holland, yay.
Hi, everyone. I think as you're getting in and getting settled, I will start introductions in just a minute. If you want to show us who you are, I think that's nice for the presenters. But definitely be muted for now if you can, so that there's not feedback, and then we'll have questions as we go along. Watch as people get in, and I'll go start getting ready to do intros. Okay, well, let's get going. We're really excited. I'm Lisa Sweezy. I'm the general manager at Buffalo Street Books. We're happy to finally get to actually hosting this event. We've tried, we've had to reschedule a couple of times for various reasons, including the COVID virus, and then just deciding that it wasn't the right time. But we've had the book for a while. It's a lovely book. And we've been hearing about the book from Diana from the Wharton Student Museum for quite a while, even before we saw the book. So we're excited to have this event going tonight. And I will introduce our various panelists. So Brett Broussard is the executive director of Cinemapolis, Ithaca's nonprofit art house cinema. He spent the past 2 decades in arts administration, working for a variety of community arts organizations and public history centers, including the Community Arts Partnership of Tompkins County, the Hanger Theater, and the Cayuga Museum of History and Art. A recovering broadcaster, he stumbled into the nonprofit sector while interning at a history museum in Bowling Green, Ohio. He holds a Bachelor of Science from the Roy H. Park School of Communications at Ithaca College and an MA in Popular Culture Studies from Bowling Green State University. Having spent a life immersed in popular culture, he traces his own cinephilia back to frequent visits to the Jerry Lewis Twin Cinema in his hometown of Cornell, New York. And those of us who are Cinemapolis fans know how important it is that we have Brett there doing that important work. And also on our panel tonight, we have Cathy Lee Crane. She is the recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the New York Foundation for the Arts, and the Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Research Center for her cinematic innovations, which combine archival material and staged live action. Her body of work received its first survey in 2015 as part of the American Original Now series at the National Gallery of Art. She is Associate Professor in Cinema Production at Ithaca College. And we have Diana Riesman from the Wharton Studio Museum, and for some reason I cannot find a full bio, but Diana is pioneering the Wharton Studio Museum here in Ithaca, making sure that we will be able to celebrate and experience the impact of the Whartons on cinema and film. And she will have a lot more to say as we go along tonight. And then our main speaker, who will speak first and share from the book that she has written, is Barbara Tepa Lupack, formerly professor of English at St. John's University and Wayne State College and academic dean at SUNY. She has written extensively on American literature, film, and popular culture. New York State Public Scholar from 2015 to 2018, and senior fellow at the Rockwell Center for American Visual Studies at the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. She is author or editor of more than 25 books. Her latest book will be coming out in early fall 2020, Being There in the Age of Trump. And today she's here to talk to us about silent serial sensations. Welcome, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize and thank the Wharton Studio Museum, Lisa and Buffalo Street Books, the History Center of Tompkins County for sponsoring tonight's event. And my thanks especially to Diana Riesman, Donna Eschenbrenner at the History Center, and Michael McGandy and everyone at Cornell University Press for their support and encouragement in my work on the Whartons from inception to fruition. And of course, I'm grateful as well to the other members of tonight's panel for their participation and to Eleanor for making the Zoom arrangements. I'm going to begin by giving you a brief introduction to the Whartons, who are of course the silent serial sensations of the book's title, and highlighting in particular their tenure in Ithaca, which was in fact the high point of their careers. It was an ordinary football game that launched Ted Wharton on what would prove to be an extraordinary career. Dispatched to Ithaca in October 1912 to film the contest between Cornell University and Penn State, Ted was impressed by the architecture of the campus and the scenic wonders of the area. So when he returned to S&A Film headquarters in Chicago a few weeks later to edit what he called his corking good footage, he pressed the company to establish a temporary studio in Ithaca, and they agreed. Although cinema was still somewhat of a novelty in those early years, Ted was already an old hand. Like D.W. Griffith, J. Cyril Dawley, and other pioneering film producers, he had begun his entertainment career performing on the vaudeville and legitimate stages, where he also gained practical managerial experience. In 1907, seeking what he said was old opportunity in the film industry, he secured a position at the Edison Company in New York City. And over the next few years, he moved on to other motion picture companies, establishing Kalem's first indoor studio and assisting in the opening of Pathé Frere's American studio, which he later directed. By 1912, he had landed at S&A, which had been co-founded 5 years earlier by George Spohr and Gilbert Anderson, who are the S and the A of the company name. There, he cemented his reputation as a daredevil among directors and established what would prove to be a real knack for bringing pathos to the screen. In the spring of 1913, with Spoor's blessing and support, Ted returned to Ithaca with the SNA Special Eastern, a complete company of 20 crew members and photo players who were led by the studio's biggest stars, Francis X. Bushman and Beverly Bain. Over the next few months under his direction, the Special Eastern completed nearly a dozen short films that incorporated university buildings, downtown landmarks, and area lakes and hills. Spoor was so pleased with the result, he urged Ted to begin scouting a permanent Ithaca location. That was certainly welcome news to Ted. Told the Ithaca Journal that there was no better field for production and no more generous a community within which to work. On his return to Chicago headquarters, however, Ted was surprised to learn that SNA had reversed itself on the Eastern Studio plan. So he decided to terminate his lucrative contract and open his own production studio in Ithaca instead. Since most early filmmaking was clustered around Chicago, New York City, and Southern California, it was a risky move, but one that Ted believed worth taking. Joining him as partner was his brother Leo, himself a former vaudeville and stage performer and an experienced director at Cathy, who had earned the show business nickname, the Man Who Knows. After assembling a top-notch acting company headed by Thurlow Bergen and Elsie Esmond, the Whartons began filming at their temporary studio. By the end of their first season, they'd already distinguished themselves with technically sophisticated films such as A Prince of India, which culminated in a daring stunt in which an actual trolley car was plunged from the bridge into the gorge below. Two events soon brought dramatic changes to the Whartons' fledgling operation. Early in 1915, William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper tycoon turned movie producer, approached the brothers with an offer to collaborate on a serial film. Hearst, who had financed the landmark Cathy Hearst serial The Perils of Pauline in 1914, knew that, in his words, two high-class directors from the same family could produce a quality picture that would give his star Pearl White an exciting encore. The Whartons, in turn, recognized that the association with Hearst's enterprise was an unparalleled opportunity. By the mid-1910s, over a third of all Americans went to the movies weekly, and serials, which could be produced quickly and profitably, satisfied the demand for new films. Serials also had the benefit of expanding attendance by women who began filling the theaters to be entertained as well as uplifted by the new women heroines on screen. Those heroines, independent modern women whose presence reverberated throughout the culture, were redefining notions of womanhood, and nowhere was their impact greater than in cinema. Consequently, almost every major studio was engaged in or planning new serial productions, often with catchy alliterative titles like Lucille Love, The Hazards of Helen, and Dolly of the Dailies. None, though, made a bigger splash than the Hearst-financed, Wharton-produced The Exploits of Elaine, which ran from 1914 to 1915, and which was reportedly the first picture to earn $1 million at the box office. The star, reigning serial queen Pearl White, had already amassed a huge following and set fashion trends nationwide. As the intrepid eponymous heroine Elaine Dodge, she resolves to track down her father's murderer, the mysterious Clutching Hand, who was film's first faceless killer. And with the assistance of Dr. Craig Kennedy, who was cinema's first forensic detective, she survives the various physical and psychological assaults inflicted on her by the villain and his accomplices. Elaine's adventures, which both thrilled and titillated viewers, spawned not just one, but two sequels, The New Exploits of Elaine and The Romance of Elaine, both 1915. Those extenders set another cinematic precedent by incorporating plot events that revolved around possession of a newly invented weapon. In this case, a supercharged torpedo, the first of many powerful devices whose plans or prototypes would be coveted by serial villains for decades to come. Adding to the good news of Elaine's popularity was the Whartons' acquisition of a permanent studio at Renwick Park at the southern tip of Lake Cayuga. Originally an amusement park, the site was ideal. It even has a tiny trolley that brought visitors from town to watch the stars in action. Best of all, the facility gave the brothers the space they sorely needed and the opportunity to expand their operation. Almost immediately, they began production on a 14-part comedy, The New Adventures of J. Rufus Wallingford, which came out in 1915, about two genial conmen intent on avenging the late Mr. Wharton, who was built out of his fortune. The serial, well received nationwide, generated special interest in Ithaca, particularly during filming when the stars were mistaken for actual robbers, and again when the skunks were imported for one of the episodes got loose and literally raised a big stink throughout the town. More groundbreaking was The Mysteries of Myra in 1916, in which 18-year-old Myra, played by Gene Southern, is terrorized by the devil-worshipping Black Lodge, whose grandmaster wants to destroy her and claim her late father's fortune. Fortunately, psychic researcher Dr. Payson Alden becomes her champion and protector. Co-written by noted spiritualist Hereward Carrington with the influence of Aleister Crowley, Myra was the first production to incorporate actual occult and magical practices. In the course of the serial, Myra is repeatedly hypnotized, placed in suspended animation, threatened by a demon spirit, assaulted by a wild-eyed thought monster, and almost incinerated by a fire elemental. Her astral body gets detached from her mortal body and collides with the masters, causing them for a time to switch identities. And in one of the many episodes with sexual connotations, she's levitated out of her bed, in her bedroom, and into the hands of the master's accomplices below. The special lighting and red hand tinting of prints created an authentic supernatural atmosphere, and according to Variety, ensured that Myra would be the serial of the year. Harnessing the numerous newspapers and magazines comprised his print empire, Hearst mounted an extensive publicity campaign, and he dedicated similar energies to promoting the subsequent Wharton Fear serials that he financed. Beatrice Fairfax, which came out in 1916, and in which Hearst made a cameo appearance, was based on a syndicated device columnist for his newspapers. In response to letters from her readers, Beatrice, played by Grace Darling, solved crimes and deftly resolved relationship problems, yet always managed to wrap up the crime or the mystery and make the midnight edition. Another new woman heroine was the daring adventurous Patria Channing, played by Irene Castle and promoted by Hearst as the best known and best dressed woman in America. Patria used her vast wealth to combat the incursions of the Mexicans and the Japanese, whom the xenophobic Hearst believed were America's true enemies. More overtly political than the other Wharton serials, Patria was designed to prepare the country to go to war. While the Whartons welcomed Hearst's financial support, they increasingly bristled at his demands for last-minute script changes, his refusal to pay for costly reshoots, and his incessant meddling. So in 1917, they severed ties with him, but it quickly became clear that the brothers, who were far better filmmakers than businessmen, had made a mistake. Despite the Wharton Releasing Company they created in New York City to distribute their films, chronic money problems kept driving them to the brink of bankruptcy. Their first independently produced feature, The Great White Trail in 1917, a sentimentalized story of love, loss, and redemption in the Arctic, brought them some much-needed financial relief, although the film fell far short of the revenue that was generated by the 1916 film The Black Stork, their controversial eugenics picture produced under Hearst's sponsorship. Nonetheless, using The Great White Trail's profits, they pressed forward with The Eagle's Eye in 1918, an ambitious serial based on actual stories of German espionage, scripted by recently retired Chief of the U.S. Secret Service, William Flynn. Although suspenseful and well-crafted, this serial was a box office failure. Apparently, following the signing of the armistice, war pictures had lost their appeal. And with the 1918 flu pandemic, movies and other public movie houses and other public buildings were forced to close, and that also affected the serial's revenue. By spring of 1919, with their studio in foreclosure, their personal finances in shambles, and their once close relationship fractured, the brothers parted ways. Leo headed west to Texas, where he assumed a position as Director General of San Antonio Motion Pictures, which produced 4 utterly forgettable films before folding in 1923. And all of them starred Macklin Arbuckle, who was the cousin of comedian and actor Fatty Arbuckle. Not long afterwards, Leo left the business. Ted remained in Ithaca after Leo's departure, but with the former Wharton studio leased to another film company, he was forced to relocate his operation to an abandoned skating rink downtown, where he undertook, although never completed, a detective serial, The Crooked Dagger. Disappointed, he left New York for Santa Cruz, California, where he attempted to establish a new production studio. When that plan failed, he found work as a screenwriter and director for various studios in Hollywood, which was by then the center of filmmaking. Yet even there, success eluded him. In 1931, 4 years after Leo's death, Ted died, broke and his early work forgotten. The Variety obituary noted that Ted was once among the highest paid film producers in the country, but he was buried by the Motion Picture Relief Fund, surely an inauspicious end for an early cinema pioneer. Although the brothers' tenure in Ithaca was short-lived from 1913 to 1919, it nonetheless was remarkable. At their Wharton studio, one of the first and most successful independent regional companies, they redefined the serial motion picture and defined many of its conventions. Embracing technological and scientific innovations, they developed sophisticated techniques and interwove current events into their progressive storylines. And they incorporated numerous special effects and thrilling stunts, including cliffhangers shot on the actual cliffs and gorges around Ithaca. Their pictures, by their own count, between 600 and 700 over the course of their careers, showcase well-known contemporary performers from Francis X. Bushman to Pearl White and Irene Castle, and other productions of theirs featured actors such as Lionel Barrymore, Warner Olin, and Oliver Hardy, all of whom would go on to find fame in Hollywood's sound films. And also notably, their pictures memorialized many Ithaca residents who also appeared as extras. So in conclusion, I just want to say that sadly, the advent of sound film production in the late 1920s, which marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of cinema, seemed to turn the page on the Whartons. Yet the impact of these prolific filmmakers on their fellow silent film producers and their profound influence on later popular genres, from television crime procedurals to sensation-filled cinema blockbusters, is undeniable. Their story is at once a singular portrait of the burgeoning film industry at a critical and transformative point in American political, social, and cultural history, and a snapshot of a magical moment in movie making when the Wharton brothers transformed their adopted town of Ithaca into Hollywood on Cayuga.
I want to applaud. That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Barbara. I think that's a great snapshot of the fascinating history that your book, in a much more detailed way, shares with the reader, and just a great way to start the conversation about this great film history that is based here in Ithaca, but really it was part of a regional film history that spreads out all throughout the Finger Lakes and Central New York region. Lisa mentioned that I was once upon a time the curator at the Cayuga Museum of History and Art, just up the road in Auburn, and that's where sound on film was developed. So what became Movietone, famous for Movietone newsreels, was a technology that Theodore Case was developing around the same time that the Whartons were here in Ithaca. So there's a lot of remarkable innovation, both in narrative and in the technology of film, that was happening all around the shores of our lakes here. So I really appreciate that as a starting point for our conversation tonight. I know Cathy is here as well to tell us a little bit about sort of the perspective of a filmmaker, and maybe if you want to perhaps ask Barbara a couple questions about the similarities and differences of film production in the early 20th century compared to the early 21st century.
Well, that's right. So it's like thanks, Diana, for inviting me to be a part of this panel. And Barbara, I'm very excited to be discussing your book, which is fantastic. So actually, my first question for you, Barbara, is your research in Ithaca, because when I was working on a project that I thought I was going to actually stage on locations in Ithaca, I found all these photographs from the silent film era amazing. Like, oh, that location, that's you could do an Arctic scene over in Teganic in the middle of winter. So I was curious if being in Ithaca during some of your research, if that helped, what that gave your project.
Oh, I think so. I began to feel as if I could experience some of the things that the Whartons had experienced. I was really very lucky because the Cornell Rare Book Library, a manuscript collection, has wonderful holdings. They have almost the entirety, that's extant anyway, of the Wharton business records. And of course, Ithaca College has the Arch Chadwick collection, and the Wharton Museum and the History Center, especially Donna Eschenbrenner, absolutely remarkable resources for me when I was doing the work. I was also very lucky because we were able to contact a woman named Karen Longley, who is a relative of Leo Wharton, and there's really no better resource than being able to go to a family member. I got so many wonderful stories and tidbits of gossip. For example, the fact that Leo had a daughter that he essentially was estranged from the preponderance of his years, and that was something that was never in any of the records that I was able to locate, had it not been for this particular relative who shared with me that particular story. So yes, I mean, it was really very exciting, and when I had the opportunity the first time around with Diana to go and visit the actual studio site, I could almost feel the Whartons there. It was just such an exciting moment.
Yeah, no, I know. I was just in Stewart Park the few weeks ago, and every time I pass that building, and I'm grateful to Diana for like sort of pointing it out as a place. Like right now, what does it have, Diana? Just the placard?
It has that interpretive sign on the lake-facing side of the building, yeah, at the moment.
But being inside that thing too is kind of amazing. And are there plans for that to happen, actually?
Well, there are also in the main bay of the building, which is, you know, for, I guess everybody knows that it is a Department of Public Works maintenance and storage facility that the Wharton Studio Museum has been working for 10 years to have it be something else. The main bay still has original tracking in the ceiling that we believe were scenery tracks or something like that. Because the films were silent, there was no need for quiet on the set or anything like that. So you do see stills from that era where you can tell that there are multiple scenes from multiple films being shot at the same time. And those scenery tracks are really just a lovely, you know, important artifact from that era. And the building is our greatest artifact. It is one of only a handful of motion picture studios of that era still standing in the country. It's by the lake in our beautiful Stewart Park, which I'm also involved with the Friends of Stewart Park. We're revitalizing the park. And developing the Wharton Studio building, not the whole building, that proved to be too challenging, but the lake facing side, 1,000 square feet, will be become the Wharton Studio Museum and Park Center with exhibits on you know, the motion picture history that took place there, and a little sort of shop office for docents for walking tours, and a cafe. The building is really, really important. As we've seen, Ithaca had 7 or more, around 7 big theaters in its time, and the only one really remaining is the State Theater, though pieces of the Crescent on Aurora Street are still there, and not so much with the Strand. So these buildings are so important to maintain and to preserve and to celebrate. And I totally agree with what Barbara said. Whenever, it was such a pleasure to, you know, walk around the building with her when we first met. But, you know, I really feel, and I am not someone who believes in sort of like spirits and ghosts, or I'm a skeptic in that area, but I definitely, when I walk there, because I've seen so many pictures and read so much, I can picture the Whartons there and what it must have been like, you know, to shoot year round in that building, and just how exciting it must have been, because they were making it up as they went along. They were really pioneers in this emerging art form and emerging industry. And, you know,
I mean, yeah, so great. I'm curious, Barbara. Yeah, no, it's such a good point about, like, we're 100 years out from that moment. And we are at another moment in the industry of radical change. I mean, COVID's just one of the things that have shifted viewing processes, but also production now. So actually the serial is a very interesting model, and we're starting to see that that's already happening in these, you know, binge-worthy series on television. But I think, you know, it's interesting to start to think about cinema as a place that can also take in that form. I wonder if you could just say something about what you discovered, if anything, about the serial as a form.
Well, for one thing, I didn't realize that it was as popular as it was. I mean, it was the most phenomenally successful form of cinema in its day. And I was amazed that serial filmmakers could produce a serial episode in as little as 3 days, and sometimes 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, 7 days. But they had to, because it was done on a weekly basis, shown, exhibited on a weekly basis. And so they had no choice but to do that. So they were amazing entrepreneurs. They were skillful in their plotting. They were, again, for silent film, I thought just absolutely wonderful in the depth of the characterizations in some of the serial characters. And all of that was just so terribly exciting to me. I didn't realize the impact of the serial on immigrants. I didn't realize the impact of the serial on women. I didn't realize that, again, that people would show up for something like a serial that ran for 114 episodes, that people would show up every week. That's more than 2 years. I mean, what a commitment that was to the craft and to the product. And I'm just curious, Cathy, I'm just wondering, as a filmmaker yourself, could you comment on what you feel is the influence that the Whartons have had? I mean, are they even recognized by filmmakers today? Are filmmakers even familiar with their work?
I think, and no, they're obscure. But we have like one of the top 10 film production programs in the United States, and at Ithaca College, and it has always been an interest of mine to draw out that history and perhaps even remodel a community-based production environment. It hasn't manifested, but I'm starting to sort of get a sense from some other people at Ithaca College now as we're trying to branch out and find other sort of models for income, that it's possible that we could be involved in creating something like a studio where students are working. And this idea that you could make an episode in 3 days, that is fantastic. That, I mean, to do that is just a beautiful thing. And so I feel like it's a very strong history to work from. And also just really how beautiful. I mean, I also teach a class on location, and we scout the city for unique looking places. And it's true. I would be like them if I were there then. It'd just come to Ithaca and go, wow, the brick, the wood, you know, it's.
And there's a lot of, you know, every year I've spoken, I think a couple of times in Cathy's class and a couple of documentary classes. Every year I get emails from wonderful Park School students who are, you know, either want to make a documentary for one of their projects about Wharton studio history, and, you know, we do interviews and all that. But on the whole, there's a lot that can be done to sort of spread the word about the Wharton history to students in general, be they at Cornell or IC, because most of them don't really, not enough people still know, people are still unaware that this history happened, you know, right in Stewart Park, and that the Whartons shot all over, you know, the county. I mean, they went to the Adirondacks also, but so there's, you know, there's a lot of work to still be done to make sure that, you know, especially if you're a film student here, the Park School, that you know about this history. And I love the idea of that production piece. I know Cathy and I have talked about that for quite a while. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. But the thing, Barbara, that I love the most, the chapter I love the most in this book, and that I will actually hope to use in one of my classes, is going independent. And I think what's interesting about that is that's what makes them pioneers, right?
Oh,
is that
absolutely.
they had this one affiliate, where was it, in Chicago? And then they came out and they just struck out, and they said, I'm gonna make something happen here. But they have the support of the whole community in Ithaca. That's the thing about Ithaca, which is actually still true about Ithaca. Which is that it's small, and I'm like, oh yeah, they cast people, of course. Like I cast actors from Actors Workshop in the films that I shoot in Ithaca, because the talent in the area is amazing. So I'm curious about that chapter specifically, because I know it's connected to business and how do you create a studio? How do you create your own studio? And I wonder if there's any anecdotal stories about the research for that chapter, or anything that you want to share about that?
Well, one anecdote that I found particularly striking was the person who served as the bursar, the treasurer at the studio, reported that there was such a collegial atmosphere among the people who worked there that oftentimes they would go 2, 3, 4 weeks without even picking up their paychecks. So it was not so much a job as it was a calling of sorts. And I just thought that was spectacular, because I think that grassroots effort really shows, especially in the earliest of their early films that they produced. I think it's such an incredible shame that as with the majority of silent films, most of the Wharton's pictures are not extant. And so it really is very, very difficult to study of their body of work when there is not really a body of work to study. And even those pictures that survive are often in fragmentary or corrupted form. And also many of them are not available to the public. You can view them, for example, at the Riesman Museum or at the Museum of Modern Art, but there's quite a hefty fee involved with that. So some of those pictures are not accessible, and I think if they were more accessible to the general public, I think that there would indeed be a greater appreciation of phenomenally pioneering efforts that they made. I mean, just the special effects that they were able to incorporate into their films. I mean, that alone. I'm just thinking, of course, obviously, of the trolley scene in A Prince of India, the trolley that's plunged from a bridge. But there were so many other special effects as well. They had a very innovative use of double exposure. We see that effect in The Exploits of Elaine, for example, as early as The Exploits of Elaine, when Dr. Kennedy is in his lab and he's thinking of the beautiful Elaine, and she appears in a kind of thought bubble behind him. And again in Myra, and also in the feature film, The Great White Trail, where it was used to create flashbacks. And in one episode of Beatrice Fairfax called The Stone God, it revolves around a stone figure that has been stolen, and bad things result. But in the depiction of the stone god being stolen from the temple, the stone god actually comes to life. I mean, it's a very, very exciting scene by itself. And Leo reported that in order to make those double exposures, it was a very difficult process. He had to run The Prince twice, and he said it was even more difficult than shooting two separate films. I also think about, there's that film that they did for George Eastman, a very short propaganda film, but a good kind of propaganda film. It was called The Mission of the War Chest, and it was meant to drum up business for what was called the Community Chest, which became the United Way that George Eastman essentially founded. And the final scene is of a young soldier, and he's standing atop all of these bodies of young men who've been, like him, who have been killed. And he's reaching out his hand towards a cross. And in that particular image, the cross is hand-tinted red to suggest the double symbolism of the Red Cross organization and also the blood that has been shed in the war. And there's so many other, I think, very, very wonderful effects. In Mysteries of Myra, in one episode, she's levitated out of her bed, and she's on the second floor, and she's levitated out the window and down to the hands of the villains below. And that involved a really very tricky use of a derrick, and then trying to hide the derrick as all of this was going on. So. And I mean, there's so many of those kinds of effects and optical illusions. Again, in The Eagle's Eye, which was, for the most part, their final serial, their unsuccessful serial, but very good serial from all reports. They built a miniature village on the shores of the lake, and then they destroyed it. And one of the things that I learned about that I thought was particularly interesting is that they built it in such a way that the actual buildings in Ithaca in the distance appeared as buildings in Ithaca in the distance. So I mean, there were just such wonderful, wonderful things that they did. They also apparently developed a very special form of close-up in The Eagle's Eye, and there are no episodes of that available, so I wish I could see that for myself. But it was described as being just extremely innovative, because it showed and registered so much emotion, more so than the usual close-up. And then they also tended to use multiple simultaneous iris shots that then opened directly into the plot action. Also, one of their crew members, Lyra Baker, invented a new form of bullet that exploded in two phases. So there'd be the initial pop, and then there'd be smoke that appeared afterwards. And again, that was imitated by many, many other filmmakers for decades to come. Mm-hmm. So I think that they do these wonderful little things that I hope are not lost to history, because they're very much a tribute to their visions.
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead.
No, I'm just going to say those are all examples of what early cinema was doing, was exploring cinematics one frame at a time, and how, well, you stop the camera on a frame and you have the person leave the frame and you continue shooting, and they're gone, they disappear. So, And we still teach on celluloid at Ithaca College. So there's the whole history of silent film is a history of visual innovation, structural, but the serial is unique and the serial is contemporary. And I think this book is really important for helping to ground that history, because it's not just cinema. The teens are like a crazy decade, you know? So they're doing this business, a war breaks out, it ends with the flu epidemic. I mean, it's you know, there's revolution everywhere. You know, Mexico and in Russia. It's a crazy decade. And so it's always interesting to me. I'm curious actually how the degree to which you engage with that more global history while you're looking at this very precise local activity.
I happen to enjoy that period very much, and I started out by doing a number of books on race filmmaking, and so I had a more national perspective. But with the Whartons, obviously, with the situation of the war raging and their association with Pathé Frère and the impossibility of distributing too much of their product, or for American filmmakers to distribute too much of their product and having to go to places like the Eclectic Film Service, which was associated with Pathé Frère, but of course people weren't supposed to know this. I mean, there are all these again, incredible ramifications that I find tremendously interesting. But yes, there are many, many, many global repercussions, and I think that they were, again, specific filmmakers who worked in a specific area, but I think the kind of work that they introduced just had a worldwide effect. I just saw the way Exploits of Lane, for example, was embraced by the French. They loved Pearl White perhaps even more than Americans did. And they recut the Exploits of Elaine. They showed it at one point. It was showing in 15 different theaters in Paris at the same time. Wow. And again, that's another tribute to their tremendous vision.
Yeah, I think it's striking too to look at precisely what you mentioned, Cathy, is the way that history is kind of repeating itself right now, a century later, looking at things like the serial being, I mean, just in the midst of this pandemic, sort of becoming the forefront of our international sensibility. This service called Quibi just launched, which is a phone-only narrative series network that is limited to 10-minute episodes, and it's every story that they tell is told very much like the serials of the early 1900s were. And I think in the same way, it's making use of a new form of distribution. It's making use of new technology, and in some ways, not with Quibi, but with other platforms that are out there, really revolutionizing the way that creators are able to get their product in front of audiences, and in sometimes a very independent fashion. And I think, you know, even what we're doing now with this virtual cinema during the pandemic has its own, I think, connections to the independent means of distribution that was very common with road showing of film in the very early days of cinema, and maybe some of this the conditions of the world in this crazy decade that we're living in, may be very well dismantling some of these, you know, the studio system that has really had a negative force on narrative innovation for, some would argue, for the last 50 years, probably, in film. But
yeah.
I mean, I did just get the 45th anniversary version of Jaws, so that really tells you everything you need to know about how the studio system has impacted narrative storytelling. But yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting echoes 100 years later. And Barbara, do you have any thoughts about sort of how today's filmmakers might learn from the Whartons and what they did?
I was going to ask that question to you. I was very curious because you're so well versed in early film and in silent filmmaking. How and where do you feel that the Whartons excelled, and where do you feel that their influence was the strongest?
Well, I mean, you focused on the serial, and I think certainly, you know, that was, as you said, it was it was the storytelling, the narrative medium of the time, and they were masters of it. And certainly you can see how that format went on to inform so much of how, I mean, certainly even in the early days of wireless radio, you know, you'd had soap operas, that then really everything from the radio drama, all early television may as well have been, well, it may as well have been a black screen, because all of the writing styles of early television, and even a lot of television today, can be watched without the visuals, because it's written in a narrative format that is very much leaning on the radio drama, which certainly I think has learned a lot from how to take that kind of serialized storytelling and place it into the oral landscape rather than the visual.
I think an interesting model that they represent and that you really explicate in the book, that I think starts with this chapter on becoming independent, is how they were able to create a studio out of and with a community. And that's actually becoming a very real grassroots approach to independent film production for features, in fact, which is why people aren't necessarily making films in Hollywood. They're going to wherever, and there's a tax rebate program. And so if you produce there and work with people who live there and cast people who live there, then you can make a film affordably, a feature. And so I actually was able to make a film because we got Ithaca College sort of authorized as a New York State production facility, where you could get a tax rebate from New York State Governor's office if you shot in and around there. So to me, it's like an exemplary model for independent production, and specifically in the community of Ithaca, it's direct.
Absolutely, and not only were they pioneering, but they were quite successful for quite a while. And so many of the regional filmmakers and independent filmmakers were lucky if they made one production or two productions before they folded. And yet the Wharton seemed to go on and on like the Energizer buddies of early cinema. And I guess they were not too frugal initially. They weren't particularly good business people. They probably could have had more resources on which to draw, but they did pretty well. And of course, with the help of Hearst, that was a welcome infusion of cash and support and publicity and promotion. But no, they were again, they deserve the success that they received because they were well ahead of their time.
One of the things that I always like to think about is that 100 years later, the things that drew Theodore and Leopold to Ithaca, to the area, are the same things that attract people today. I mean, they really, they must have thought this through. And as Barbara said, Ted Wharton came here on assignment from the S&A company, and he looked around and he said, this is so beautiful. There's this college campus on a hill. There's these gorges. There's this incredible melding of the rustic and the urban, so that they could shoot scenes, in nature with waterfalls behind them or in the gorges. And then 5 minutes away, they could be downtown in an urban setting. And so it's very, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And ultimately, yes, so much has changed in the movie industry in terms of technology and all that. But it all is the same. Like, what does it come down to? It comes down to telling a good story, that story. And I just, the Whartons had these stories to tell in their heads, and they came to Ithaca and they embraced the community, and the community embraced them back.
And I think you're definitely to be congratulated for the work you're doing through the Wharton Studio Museum, because you're telling their story, and telling their story is telling the story of cinema as well. So you deserve kudos for all of your efforts.
Thank you, Barbara. And, I really feel like your book is doing such a wonderful job in really putting the Whartons and Ithaca on the map as this center, this bustling center of filmmaking, 100 years ago.
Well, thank you all for those very gracious comments. But Diana, I know you were considering elaborating a little bit on the Wharton Studio Museum's role in the Finger Lakes Film Trail, which is, I think, a very important development in preserving and celebrating the legacy of the Whartons.
Yeah, when Brett mentioned the Case Research Lab in Cayuga Museum, where he used to work in Auburn, they are our partners, along with the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, in the Finger Lakes Film Trail, which we launched last year with a screening at Eastman. And Barbara has been just instrumental in getting that started. So basically, if you go from Eastman to the Eastman Museum, the beginnings of like film stock and early film, to Ithaca for the silent piece, and then continue on to the Case Research Lab, you have this lovely narrative of early, modern, early American filmmaking. So it's not a walkable trail for sure, but we're really excited to be partnered with, an amazing place like the Eastman Museum and the Case Research Lab. I also highly recommend to people to go see the original laboratory of Mr. Case, who, as I think either Barbara or Brett mentioned, is credited with being the first person to sync sound to picture. And it's all in the Finger Lakes, and it's just it's an exciting history.
So I wondered, we're getting a little, close to the end of the time we've allotted, and I wanted to give time for other people to ask some questions. Does anyone have a question? I think I saw a hand raised at some point. You want to unmute and share your question? Thank you.
Yes, hi. Oh, this has just been splendid. Barbara, I'm curious, were you able to glean what their personalities were like? Were they type A, detail-oriented? I heard the term collegial atmosphere. Were they partiers? I mean, what did you glean from that, their personalities? I'm just curious.
I wasn't able to get as much information in that line as I would have liked, but apparently Ted loved to gamble and often did, and both of them apparently did not shy away from being social drinkers. And their sister, Eugenia, who was married to Mr. Buck, apparently was a spiritualist, and she believed in a lot of the things that were portrayed in the Mysteries of Myra. And I think that's very interesting because, of course, Western and Central New York were centers for the spiritualist movement. So it's not surprising, but somehow I never would have suspected it of them. By some reports, and again, they can't be completely confirmed, but Ted tended to be the more steadfast of the two. And Leo, apparently, if you believe certain reports, again, not confirmed, but he tended to fall to pieces, and he was a very nervous sort. Apparently also he left to the entertainment industry for almost 8-year period, and then he couldn't resist, and he came back, and he left when he was still working on the stage, and came back because the lure of the cinema, the lure of the movies was something that drew him back. So that was the period in which he settled back in Texas, and in which he married the first time, and again had this daughter that from whom he was estranged for the most of his life. So they were interesting characters, and it really would have been delightful to have been able to find out more about their personal quirks. But I mean, really, they were such pioneers and such inventive men. I would imagine they had a lot of charming and not so charming quirks.
Does anyone else have any questions? Or anyone else on the panel still have something they want to
Mr. McCaffrey, I believe, does.
Ah, yes.
Yes, this is, I'd sent in a question about, that was half answered, about the influence possibly of the Whartons on Louis Fouillade, who made serials with a little bit more of a surrealistic bent about the same time in France. And your mention of the of the reception of Elaine in France reminded me, and the discussion of the law of how many of these films are lost, drew a parallel in my head with the fact that in art and other things, lost things were not always lost. These films were around for a number of years and influenced people, and you can trace those influences. And in the case of the Whartons, not only through the development of serials, and it's coming back every now and then with the sci-fi serials of the 30s and current television, but through homages as well. Turner Classic Movies recently showed 2 films that reminded me of this. Georges Franju's Judex, which is a feature film remake of a Fouillade serial, which is very, it doesn't treat its source ironically or anything like that. It's very beautiful and a little bit conservative in that sense, unlike Irma Vep by Assayas years later. And that's maybe one way of, not only through what remains of Wharton and the French films and others, of appreciating what the Whartons contributed to film history. The other one a few weeks ago was Peter Bogdanovich's Nickelodeon. Got horrible reviews when it came out. But I watched the black and white version of it, and aside from a few moments when I felt a little bit bored, I really liked it all the way through. Maybe my standards are lower than most critics, but there were some parallels I was surprised to find during this discussion between the Whartons and the story in Nickelodeon. It starts out in Chicago. The main character at times works for the Edison Trust, and other times pitted against the Edison Trust. Like Leo, he leaves for the American Southwest, and like Ted, he ends up in Los Angeles. And so that's a very given. It may not be a masterpiece, but it's a very interesting look at and very accurate from as far as I can tell. Look at the Hollywood of that period or just before that period. It takes place in the early 10s rather than the late 10s.
Well, thank you. That's a fascinating perspective, and I'm going to have to look at Nickelodeon again and follow up on some of the things that you've suggested. Those are very, very interesting adaptations of some of the ideas of the Wharton. I should also add that just getting back to the quirkiness of the brothers, both of them became involved in their later years. Leo in a more troublesome fashion, but with a company that purported to teach students how to write for the cinema, and it also alleged that it would help them sell their scripts, and that wasn't the case. I mean, he became involved, Leo, in a very nefarious enterprise, and that's what ended his time in the business in any way. I mean, he was taken to court and he was fined because apparently they simply couldn't fulfill any of the promises that they had made through this particular production company. Interestingly, Ted was involved in a company like that too, but it was a little bit more of a legitimate enterprise, and he certainly did not come to the ignominious end that Leo did. So it was a shame. Both of them had unfortunate situations in their later years that in some ways eclipsed the wonderful work that they did in their heydays, certainly in Ithaca.
A word of warning for creative writers, both sorts of that company are still around.
That's right. That's right. That's a good point.
Well, we're getting close to the end of our time. I just want to jump in and thank everyone for participating. I want to, of course, remind people that this conversation is about this fabulous book that you can order from Buffalo Street Books. We'd love to sell some more to people in our community. It's beautiful and shiny. I mentioned how shiny it is.
It's very shiny.
And I don't know, I thought maybe Diana, do you have a little bit to say to sort of end the evening and talk a little bit about what's coming up for Wharton Studio Museum, where you were at, what the status is of situations?
I'd love to do that. So we, just in very general terms, we are working to develop the building into the Wharton Studio Museum and Park Center. And some work on the building will be starting in October with the bathrooms, actually. That's why I was interested in what talking to Brett earlier today. But, like everyone, we've had to transition from having in-person events, which this was supposed to be with Barbara, signing books at a table at Buffalo Street Books, and we'd be sipping wine and all that. And so we just wrapped our Silence Roar Film Festival, which is presented with the support of the Park School at Ithaca College, and it's a student film festival for middle and high school students in the Southern Tier. And it was very hard to pull off this year because we lost touch with all the students after schools closed. But we did end up with 5 submissions, and we did it as a live stream about a week or so, or 2 weeks ago. And the 5 films were wonderful. We awarded prizes. We had a great icy jury. Cathy was a juror last year when we did it in the Park Auditorium. And next up for us, we're actually, with the Cherry Theater, we produced a headphone walking play in 2018 called The Missing Chapter, that's set in the era of the Wharton Studio against the backdrop of the motion picture studio, and it's inspired by Beatrice Fairfax, the 1916 serial that was mentioned. And we did that in collaboration with the Cherry after they did a beautiful job of a walking headphone play called Storm Country, based on Grace Miller White's novel, Storm Country. She's a local Trumansburg author. And we are bringing those back in the age of Corona. We are bringing them back as a self-guided upload that you can do from your phone. We're hoping to launch on July 11th. And you can do either one for a suggested amount, very small, $5 contribution. And we just love that we can sort of give not a new life, but a continued life to these plays. And what a perfect thing to do to socially distance, be outside, learn about Ithaca's history, and experience the west end of the city in Storm Country and Stewart Park with The Missing Chapter. And then we do a movie Under the Stars. I'm not sure, I think Brett has been to that, maybe. Every August, it's our 10th year. It's at Teganic on a big screen with live music by Cloud Chamber Orchestra. And we are hoping to do it as a drive-in this year, waiting the final word from New York State Parks and Historic Preservation are our partners in that. And so doing that, and then we, Barbara, can I mention we found out some lovely news today that we are receiving a grant from Humanities New York to do a series on race films and race matters, conversations about race, that was going to be a lecture series here at Eastman and at Case, but is now going to be a totally digital series program that will be available online. And we just found out that we got a grant to do that, and that will happen this fall. So it's really exciting and timely. And there's just some amazing race films that we've shown with Barbara giving a lecture at Cinemapolis. And so we're really excited about that. And, we're just moving forward to the best of our ability, like everyone.
Yeah, that sort of sums it up, moving forward to the best of our abilities. Well, this was an excellent example of that, and I think it was really informative and lovely to get us all remembering the fascinating history of our area, and we look forward to all the future events, and definitely pick up a copy of the book and keep track of what's happening with the Wharton Studio Museum. Thank you, everybody, for being
Thank you,
part.
Lisa. If I could just say, I feel very much like the Whartons in this regard. They benefited enormously from the generosity of their community. And I too, in working on this particular project, benefited immensely from the enormous kindness and generosity of the people in Ithaca and the resources that I was able to discover in Ithaca. And like so many writers, writers tend to write in isolation. And so it is so immensely gratifying to get such a generous response from readers. So I'm very, very, very grateful to all of you. And I thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Lisa.
Thank you,
and
Barbara.
Diana.
Thank you, everyone.
Everybody. Good night.